What they have done in order to get counts, in order to be able to detect that people were infected, is they develop a list of symptoms. There might be 12 symptoms. And one of the symptoms, for example, is, oh yeah, I coughed more often this week than last week. That kind of thing. Okay. So it's bogus stuff. And all you need to be counted as having developed COVID is, in one of the papers, just to give you an example, the Pfizer paper, one of the 12 symptoms and a positive PCR test. So you need one tenuous symptom and a bogus PCR test, and you're a COVID case.
I am joined today by Denis Rancourt, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. But before he does so, I want to cite one of your fairly recent tweets, Denis. You tweeted, "As an established interdisciplinary scientist, I'm qualified to identify fake science driven by agendas. All this COVID nonsense is fake science, tunnel vision, tenuous conclusions, glaring omissions, false working assumptions, silence on uncertainties, inaccessible data." So I think that that is a really powerful tweet that I would like you to unpack. But before doing so, I'm sure most of the people that would follow my YouTube or my Twitter are already very well familiar with yourself. But could you please just tell us as much as you want about yourself and your qualifications?
I don't want to tell you that much about myself. I could go on for a long time. But no, I was a full professor, which is the highest academic rank with tenure at the University of Ottawa, professor of physics for more than 20 years, a couple of decades. I had a large research laboratory. I ran a big team. I was internationally recognized in several areas of science. That's why I say I'm interdisciplinary. I've published in journals related to everything from biochemistry to environmental science to soil science to theoretical physics to all kinds of things. I've written over 100 papers in leading peer-reviewed scientific journals. I'm a thinker. I'm an intellectual. I'm a researcher. I was a research supervisor. I have supervised many graduate students who went on to become science researchers themselves, and professors and teachers and so on. So I've had a very full career. And I've had a lot of conflicts with my employer, which have recently, I was dismissed way back in 2009. There was a big legal battle, and there was a large global settlement was reached in 2019. It took 10 years. So that is settled. And I've been, I am still a researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. So that's something I'm really keen on and that I do. And whenever there is a scientific debate in society that I find is very important, I take the trouble to learn what the relevant science is as quickly as I can and to participate in the debate, because I find that I have a large capacity to understand science in different disciplines. And one of the reasons I have that capacity is because I am an expert in scientific measurement methods. I know all about, and I taught at the graduate level, all the different ways that science has to actually measure things, whether it be electron microscopy or some kind of spectroscopy, nuclear spectroscopy, diffraction methods. I actually have done fundamental research in the measurement methods of science. And I've applied and developed statistical methods. I've applied and developed some of the leading analysis methods for spectroscopy and so on. I did a lot of things which gave me a very broad knowledge of the methods of science and also the concepts of science at the molecular level. How do molecular reactions occur? How do you know, how do things stick to surfaces? So I know a lot about the fundamental processes that are involved when a virus sticks to a cell, the surface of a cell and so on. I actually know these things intimately at the molecular level. I taught quantum mechanics at the graduate level, and so on and so on. So I have a broad science background, a very deep and broad science background, and therefore I'm able to read a scientific article and discern what I would call bullshit, to be blunt, and where the authors are not being honest in the way that they're portraying what they did, where they're covering up certain things. I can read between the lines. I can see what they're doing. I can see what they're not mentioning. I can see where they're not telling their methods sufficiently that you could reproduce the work, and therefore, you know, I know what that implies. So I can read scientific papers, and so it's for all those reasons that I'm able to make the statement in the tweet that you read. That you know, I've come to the conclusion that a lot of the published, peer-reviewed published science related to COVID and vaccines is well, to, you know, you can call it fake science, because it's not science. It does not, the well, I don't know if you want me to launch right into this, but I did have an occasion to look at the articles that claim that the vaccines are effective. There are many articles now, about a dozen, that.
And I'm sorry, just to interrupt. When you say the vaccines, I assume you're speaking of the Western pushed Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and
Yeah, the COVID vaccines, if you like. I'm particularly thinking of the messenger RNA vaccines.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I looked at the papers that were eventually published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature to see to what extent can they rigorously claim that these vaccines are effective. And I have concluded that those papers are not science, in the sense that there is no way you can know what they actually did. Okay, there's many things wrong with these papers, generally speaking. First of all, and this is not hidden, they're completely funded by pharma. All right, so there might be 30 co-authors on the paper, but the paper says itself that it is entirely funded by pharma. Some of them actually explicitly say that the writing that the particular company, Pfizer, for example, is responsible for writing this article. You know, so it's not just that there's an influence, they're actually writing these articles. And when you look at the articles, to evaluate if a vaccine is effective, you need to have a randomized controlled trial where you have two groups, one group that receives a placebo and another group that receives the vaccine, whether it's one dose or two dose. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to follow the people in those two groups to see if they develop COVID. All right. And if you find that in the 2 months over which you observe them, let's say you wait 7 days after you've vaccinated, and then in the next month or two, you try to see if in those two groups who might develop COVID, and you count the people who develop COVID. That's how the experiment is designed. That's how they think of it. And so there's so many problems with this research, I got to tell you, but it's hard for me to keep up in my mind how to explain everything that's wrong with it, but here we go. Okay. So the way that they're detecting whether or not COVID develops, you see that the idea is if more COVID develops in the control group that receive the placebo, then they can claim that the vaccine is effective, right? And if many more than the few that developed them that were vaccinated, then you can claim a relative percentage of effectiveness. Okay, that's where this 95% that you hear about all over the media, that's where it comes from. So you have to realize that 95% is based on a very small number of individuals who developed COVID after being vaccinated either by the placebo or the vaccine. Okay.
Right.
So already it's small numbers, even if there were relatively large numbers in the trials themselves. So there's potential for error there. Now, in addition to that, what are they calling a COVID infection? That's a key point. See, what they typically do, it's not what you should do. What you should do is count only the people who develop a clinical illness that you can ascribe to the pathogen that you think is of concern. In other words, it should be about an actual clinical illness that you can then confirm through a laboratory measurement that there is the presence of this pathogen as well. Okay. Well, let me tell you right off that the great majority, it's not even a clinical illness that they're talking about. So what they have done in order to get counts, in order to be able to detect that people were infected, is they develop a list of symptoms. There might be 12 symptoms. And one of the symptoms, for example, is, oh yeah, I coughed more often this week than last week. That kind of thing. Okay. So it's bogus stuff. And all you need to be counted as having developed COVID is in one of the papers, just to give you an example, the Pfizer paper, one of the 12 symptoms and a positive PCR test. And the PCR test is done by that bogus PCR methodology that was recommended and was accepted by most laboratories. So you need one tenuous symptom and a bogus PCR test, and you're a COVID case.
What are some of the other, aside from a cough once or twice this week, what are some of the other symptoms?
Oh, it's all the usual symptoms related to viral respiratory diseases. So headaches, any sneezing, all these kinds of things. So there's a list of them, and they can get, so very few of the cases were actually people getting very sick. They're virtually none. Okay, they're small groups, and this is how they're counting it. Now, there's a lot of potential for having bias when that's how you detect whether or not the person was infected. And if anyone in the procedure, I mean, they're people, the observers asking questions of the test subjects, if anyone has knows or wants to tilt the results, it's very easy to get biased results in a situation where that's what you're looking at. In other words, the person doesn't have to be in a state where they have to lie down and they have a clinical illness, but all you're doing is asking them questions and doing a PCR test. Lots of potential for bias, okay? The other thing is, these tests are not blind. They're not blind tests, which is incredible. When you read the papers, the term they often use is observer blinded. Well, observer blinded means that the person that is asking questions about symptoms and observing people and interacting with people doesn't know if the subject received the placebo or the vaccine. All right. However, the person who injected the subject, the pharmacist who injected, does know what he's injecting. It was not blind. It was not a blind. These are not blind tests. Now, that is right off the bat, that means this was not a proper randomized controlled trial. Imagine you're in the middle of a pandemic. You have all this propaganda going on. Everyone wants to survive. There's real fear among people, and they're part of this trial. They want the vaccine. The pharmacist injecting knows what he's injecting, whether it's the placebo or the vaccine, knows that when he observes in the next half hour, he has to be more careful if it was the vaccine than if it was the placebo, and so on and so on. There's all this built in. Humans are really good at guessing reality based on body language and circumstances and the nonverbal communication and so on. So right there, that is a fatal flaw in the design of these studies. They're not blind. Incredible when you think of it. And so these are the kinds of fundamental errors that are in virtually all of these vaccine tests that establish efficiency. Not to mention that they're only talking about relative efficiency of the vaccine. Like I explained, the few people that got it, the relatively small group of people that got it having received the placebo versus having received the vaccine, and you compare those two in a ratio. So it's a relative effectiveness, whereas they should have also reported the absolute effectiveness, because the absolute effectiveness reports on the basis of, but are people developing these symptoms? How many in the test group? What fraction? So the people, it turns out in all these studies, roughly 1% of the people had eventually developed what they call COVID based on this bogus method using a list of symptoms and a PCR test. Okay, so it's only 1%. So you're comparing, 1% to 1.5% placebo versus, and so on. And the difference between those two percentages is what we call the absolute effectiveness. Okay. So that difference is typically 1%. So there's an absolute effectiveness of these vaccines. Even if you use their crazy methods to get as many infections counted as possible, the absolute effectiveness is only 1%. In other words, this is not an extraordinarily virulent respiratory disease. It's nor is it extraordinarily one that everyone's going to get. It doesn't transmit any more efficiently than the flu and so on, which is already very contagious. But still, so you have to put it into that perspective as well. So not only is it improper methods that are highly susceptible to being biased, but it's also not put in the context that people are not dying in the street. Come on,
Right.
it's not put into that context. So that's the problem with these articles. That's why I call it fake science.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that makes them fake science is if you wanted to verify these people who were ascribed as having developed COVID after receiving the placebo, because that's the key. You need, as if you're putting your Pfizer hat on, you're saying to yourself, I need a lot of people who received the placebo to be counted as having developed COVID. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, if that's your game, if that's what you're trying to do, and then you count them, if someone wants to check that, they have to go and look at the detail case by case. Since they're small numbers, they have to look at each one that you say was infected. And they have to say, well, what symptoms did they have? How did you ask whether they had those symptoms? How did you determine it? What test exactly did you use? Which PCR test? How many cycles? They don't even say those things in the article, okay?
Wow.
They just give this broad term, they don't even call it PCR, okay? Some sequencing, standard sequencing methods and so on, right? So you have to go and look at the details. The devil is in the details. Well, guess what? The details, that is their actual data, is not accessible. The editors of these top journals, the top medical journals, did not impose in this very important science that they make public all of their data right away. Otherwise, we won't publish this. That was never a condition. It should be.
Okay.
And so, of course, they have all this data. Of course, they have all the Excel spreadsheets and everything, because they wouldn't be able to write the article if they didn't have the data. And the editor should have said, look, we run a science journal here. We don't run a propaganda outfit. So if you want to claim this, you're going to have to, on our website, put all of your data up so that every scientist, and even members of the public, if they want, can go and look at these 100 people that you claim were infected having received the placebo and see the details of how you are claiming they were infected and how serious the infection was. And did you really uniquely ascribe it? Did you correctly ascribe it to COVID? What does that even mean? What symptoms did they have? Were they sick, in fact? What's the potential for bias? Who observed them? What was the protocol to ensure that the person asking the questions really could know nothing about it? How was the fact that it was not a blind test, that the pharmacist who injected knew, what is the design of the study such that that information is carried through and the person is very conscious of it? And what are all the things that kind of support them in their idea that they really got the vaccine rather than the placebo and so on? All these details about study design and about what was measured, when was it measured, at what date did they develop these symptoms, when was it done, who were the ones that did develop symptoms but that you excluded, and why, and what were your reasons for excluding? All these details of the study itself, we cannot access it. So basically, the people who are approving these studies at the government level, they will ask for this kind of information, and they get these very partial reports. Pharma freeze a bit of data because they're asked to, and they always massage it and they always put it in a nice report. You never see the data really. So
Now, have you ever?
that means this is not science. Science is something you can verify. Science is something where everyone can repeat your experiment, can know what you did in order to be able to repeat it. So it's not science. It's
Have you come
propaganda.
across this before? Ever before the COVID hysteria? Have you come across a scientific paper for which there's no data?
Yes, this is common in the areas of science that have that are political,
Mhm.
that are driven by large, often global agendas, and where the results are complex. You're not just measuring a certain quantity and reporting it, and there's only a graph of, let's say, 10 or 20 or 30 measurements, but where you're doing a whole bunch of things and analyzing the data with sophisticated statistical techniques. So the area that I have seen that is notorious is everything related to global warming, climate change. I mean, the temperature data itself is manipulated to a large extent. It's corrected for all these effects. I mean, we could get into it, but a weather station, the measurement of air surface temperature in a weather station is extraordinarily susceptible to artifacts. Okay, so there's a shield around the weather station where the thermometer is, and that if the paint is aging on the shield, that changes the result. If there isn't a shield on the bottom to block the infrared radiation from the ground, that changes the result. If it's not properly ventilated, if there's not airflow through the shielded area where you're measuring the temperature, that dramatically changes the result, and so on and so on. If you have more or less trees, if you freshly paved or paved more of the area around the weather station, these are typically at airports, that changes the result. And all these changes to the result are of the magnitude or greater than the changes over many decades that are ascribed to global warming. And I've seen papers published by government scientists where the raw data goes like this, and after corrections, it goes like that. Okay, wow. It's just unbelievable. And you look at, well, how did they make these corrections, and how do they justify making the corrections? And it makes no sense. It's not justified. So there's a lot of very biased science in relation to global warming. There's a real powerful agenda behind global warming, and it propagates into all the institutions, and government scientists in particular are guilty of this. Same with NASA data. There are a lot of independent researchers who've looked at this, but you can actually go and read the papers as well, and it's just amazing how bad it is. So that's the other area of science where I've seen this kind of fake science.
Okay. Now, Denny, you were, I would say, ahead of the game. I don't want to, as I was saying before, pigeonhole you to this one subject, because you are, as you've already explained to us, that you have a vast scientific knowledge. So aside from your very important work on masks, what else have you been working on that you think is really relevant to this conversation about COVID and the hysteria that we've been put through the past year plus?
Right. Well, I want to start by reminding your listeners what I did regarding masks. Way back on the 11th of April, 2020, I published this paper entitled "Masks Don't Work: A Review of the Science Relevant to Policy in the COVID Era." So that paper was my review of pretty much everything that had been done on masks. That is the highest quality research, where you do a randomized control trial with a verified outcome. And what I found was, and I was the first to put out a review like that, where I pointed out that everything we knew from the high quality science that had been done shows that you cannot detect an advantage to wearing a mask in relation to being infected by one of these viral respiratory diseases. Okay, and I argued that in detail. I reviewed it, and I showed that all the quality randomized control trials give the same conclusion. That had a big impact. It was cited everywhere. It was seen. It was read on ResearchGate some 400,000 times before they took it down, and they took it down for bogus reasons. They said they actually said they took it down because it was being read too much and being reposted on various sites that they didn't like, and so on. And so that's why they took it down. Anyway, that I think I was the first to really point this out in a systematic way. That hey, there's a lot of science out there. This is not a different beast. It's a viral respiratory disease. It'll be transmitted in the same way. This is why we believe it's transmitted in the same way. Here are the physical mechanisms, and here are the actual randomized control trials that show it. And so I think I really nailed it with that article that came out as quickly as I could put it out. and that established that. And as a result, many felt threatened by what I had written. And the government of Quebec, even on its official website, um, fact-checked me personally and that article. And it's still up on their website. So that's an indication that people were reading it and it was having an impact. So that was the masks. But as you point out, I've been doing other things as well. The next important article that I wrote that was COVID related is this article that I published on the 2nd of June, 2020. And this was now about mortality. It wasn't about masks at all. I went straight into the all-cause mortality data and wrote what I think is a very important article. I'm going to show, should I show it on the screen?
Yeah, please, please.
Yeah, this is the article. There's the title there. Okay. So it's all-cause mortality during COVID-19, no plague, and a likely signature of mass homicide by government response. It's a very radical title, but it's a solid, rigorous article looking at all-cause mortality, explaining why you need to look at all-cause mortality. And so I was the first in this article. I believe I was the first. I'm claiming that I was the first to show that there was a COVID peak, a sharp peak in all-cause mortality versus by week or by month, versus time, a very sharp peak that was synchronous. It shot in right after the World Health Organization announced that we need to prepare our hospitals and that we're in a pandemic now and it's time to be afraid. That's the start of this sharp COVID peak. So it was synchronous with that. Most importantly, also, that peak did not occur in many jurisdictions. So it occurred sharply it was over within 2 months. It was March, April 2020 was that sharp peak. Started up right after the March announcement by the World Health Organization. But importantly, I was the first to point this out and how important it is. That peak did not occur in many jurisdictions. So if you go into the United States and look at the peak at that time in all-cause mortality, it simply does not occur or is barely detectable in the majority of states in the United States. Yet it's very large in other states like New York, for example, which is the famous one. Right. So this is unprecedented for a pandemic. A pandemic, by definition almost, is something that hits everybody equally, especially neighboring states and neighboring towns and neighboring everything. It doesn't stop at borders. So in that sense, this was not a pandemic. You can go from department to department in France, and you will find that only 9 of the 33 departments had this peak. The others didn't. So it's very granular. So I was the first to point out that this is an extremely granular all-cause mortality feature that is not characteristic of a pandemic or of any seasonal viral respiratory diseases. This has never happened in the history of epidemiology, where a large feature in all-cause mortality is granular on a jurisdiction basis. So I was the first to point that out. I also, therefore, on the basis of observations like that on the data, I concluded that it had to be the response that killed people, not the pathogen itself in the usual seasonal way that these pathogens operate. And I argued that in detail in that paper. So I think that was a very important paper, and I don't think it has been recognized like it should have been by scientists, epidemiologists, and people have not recognized that I did that. I did it rigorously and I did it early on, and I was the first to point out these important features. So that's something I did.
In that paper, did you get into what the what responses were causes of death?
I tried to ascertain what the responses could be, and I linked to various things that are known in the scientific literature. So, for example, locking people into care homes is one of the worst things you can do. And this was known already. Epidemics in care homes because of viral respiratory diseases are common and have been studied in the scientific literature. You don't lock people into the care homes. You try to spot the first few people that get a flu, and you take them out of the care home. That's what you do. You
Yeah.
don't leave them in to infect everyone else. Here they were doing even worse than that. They were injecting the care homes with sick people from hospitals. So they were preparing the hospitals for the not so sick people that would develop COVID. And so in New York, for example, there was a mass transfer of people from hospitals into care homes and then locking down the care homes. So they were seeding infections into the care homes and locking them in. Now, all of these viral respiratory diseases transmit, and this is something that I find unbelievable, how scientists can argue that they transmit through fomites and contact and wash your hands and spitballs and all that kind of stuff. It's complete garbage.
Mhm.
If you read with a critical eye, a large amount of the scientific literature, it's clear that the main transmission vector is aerosol particles. And how and why they're still debating this is beyond me.
So
But
for a non-scientific minded person like myself,
yeah,
can you explain how aerosol particles are transmitted? Obviously,
yeah.
you're saying not by handshakes, not by surfaces.
That's right. So aerosol particles are the smallest particles that come out when you breathe or when you cough or sneeze or whatever. So there will be big particles, but there will be a bunch of small particles. The big particles don't matter because they're so big, they're heavy, they fall out of the air right away. They don't go into people's lungs. Whereas the aerosol particles float in the air, they become part of the fluid air, and they occupy the room. So that they're in a place where someone was infected. These aerosol particles can be in the air for days in suspension, and someone walks into the room, they breathe it into their lungs. Okay, that's how transmission occurs. It occurs in the built environment where there's no aeration, where there's no wind or anything like that. You have a high density of these aerosol particles that are in suspension in the air, and you breathe them into your lung, and the infection is through those pathways. That's how infection occurs. Now, um, that's why masks don't work as well. If you ask me why is it, what's the mechanism whereby masks don't work? Well, the infectious aerosol particles are part of the fluid air, are extremely small, and they will go around the mask just like the air does when you're breathing in or out.
Mhm.
And so there's unless you glue a plastic sheet over the entire person's nose and mouth, you're going to get transmission because people are going to move the mask. The fact of breathing out detaches the mask. You have wrinkles, you have beards, you have all kinds of things. There's so masks don't work for that reason as well. So you see, it all fits together. It's all about aerosol particles, and so aerosol particles in a care home where the windows are closed, are everywhere in the care home pretty much. They get around, like you open the patient's door, it's in the hallway and so on. So transmission occurs in the built environment. That's where you get these events. And this has been studied rather extensively. There are examples where everybody on an airplane got the same kind of flu from being in the airplane together, where there was one or two people sitting on the tarmac, where one or two people had it, and they saw that a lot of people got it. And there are all kinds of scientific studies that have shown this. The density of aerosol particles in daycare centers for children have been measured extensively. They showed that this is what was happening. And so there's lots of studies about this. And there's also some fundamental physics work that shows that aerosol particles carrying viruses are stable in air. And what controls their suspension in air is the absolute humidity. Okay, so if the air is dry in terms of absolute humidity, the aerosol particles will stay suspended for a very long time. That's why you have high transmission in the winter. That's why all of these diseases are seasonal. They're always seasonal. There's a huge hump in the winter, and then it dies down in the summer. There's no transmission in the summer when the absolute humidity is high, when it's humid. And that's also why there is no seasonal viral respiratory diseases near the equator, where the climates are humid, and that's also why the hump in deaths occurs in our summer, their winter in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so all of this is extremely well understood and has been known. The thing about seasonality and the connection with absolute humidity has been known for more than a decade, and there's some really important landmark work that has established that. So all of this science is known. So there's no bewilderment here about what's going on and what affects transmissivity, why there is this very regular cycle. I can show you from my original paper what typically this cycle looks like. I know this is not the nicest way to do it, but here's all-cause mortality in the USA versus time. You can see the years there, and you can see the COVID peak in March, April 2020. Okay, and you can see these humps every winter, very regular and always about the same size, different shapes and so on, depending on the details. What's amazing about those humps is that they're occurring in the same way, same shape, and at the same time around the world, always. In the Northern Hemisphere, mid-latitude countries. You go to European country to European country, state to state in the United States, province to province in Canada. It's the same humps everywhere that start at the same time, end at the same time, are about the same magnitude. It's a very, it doesn't, these diseases do not start in France and eventually spread to the US and things like that. They don't operate that way. When you look at all-cause mortality, it's all synchronous. Okay, so this is one of the paradoxes to understand. Eventually, if we want to understand these diseases, that's one of the paradoxes that we have to deal with, how it's all synchronous in time. So, but that's just part of the ongoing research, right? There's there's a lot of things that are still not understood, but there's a lot of things that most scientists should know and don't know, that are working in this field, or that forget, or that they seem muddled about.
You spoke of seasonality and why we don't see these viruses transmitted in summer. So according to the official narrative, there are variations or mutations or whatever they're calling them nowadays, new variants. How are they being transmitted in the summer? Are they being transmitted? And here's a question I feel like not wary of asking, but just like because I am so ignorant when it comes to anything scientific matters. But I have read and heard discussions about the fact that this COVID virus has not been isolated. Is that anything you can speak to?
You'll have to remind me, because there's two parts to your question. So
Yeah, it's like,
I might deal with the first part first, and then you'll
sure.
have to get back to that one. Okay. Generally speaking, viral respiratory diseases do not transmit in a humid environment, and therefore do not transmit in the summer. However, that doesn't mean they don't transmit at all. I mean,
Okay.
if you're infected and you're in close contact with someone for a long time, even though the particles aren't suspended for a long time, it's possible that you could transmit it. Okay. Close contact, by close contact, I mean you're talking and breathing in each other's faces for a long time, and one person is infectious and is clearly clinically sick, and the other person is not, then you could transmit it that way even in the summer. But generally speaking, the dominant transmission in society is when the air has low absolute humidity. Okay. Because the kind of transmission that's possible in a humid environment is not going to be common. It's not going to be common enough to actually get spread of the disease. Those people are, the few people who do get infected are going to recover, and then it's not going to spread anymore. So that's the idea there. So you could create an artificial situation where these things spread in the summer. For example, if you forced everyone to live in the built environment, and the built environment were air conditioned on a large scale, and therefore the absolute humidity was low in that built environment, and you were always there, you could suspend aerosol particles there and get transmission.
Like in a quarantine hotel, for example.
Yeah. So you could exactly. So the built environment is going to can create a local circumstance that is not like the usual seasonal weather.
Mhm,
Okay,
mhm,
so it's possible, and that would need to be studied. And but you could get events like that. However, let me say something else that's really important. In the United States, for the first time since all-cause mortality has been measured, let's say since the Second World War and even before, something happened which is really dramatic in the summer after the COVID peak in 2020, which is there wasn't a summer in terms of all-cause mortality. In other words, there was a high death rate in the United States and in the summer even. So when you look at that seasonal pattern, you normally go down to a summer trough.
mhm,
Well, between 2020 and 2021 in the United States, they did not go down to the trough. They
mhm.
stayed high, which is shocking, amazing. And I can't believe that scientists and epidemiologists are not screaming about this because it's a completely novel phenomenon. It's never happened before, and very, very high all-cause mortality deaths in the US. Now, we've been looking at that in my continuing research with a couple of collaborators. We're looking at that in some detail. We haven't published on that specifically yet, but we've looked at it enough that I can tell you about it. Um, that that summer death, all-cause death in the United States. By the way, the United States is the worst country that had this. Other countries didn't have it. In Europe, everyone went down to the summer trough levels of all-cause mortality. In
Mhm.
Canada, pretty much as well. But in the US, it stayed high. So we think the US is special in that there is a large population of very vulnerable people who don't who are going to be suffering in the summer if you take away their part-time jobs, if you don't allow them in the hot summer to be outside and cool themselves off in the shade by whatever method they normally do. If you disrupt them and you're forcing them to live inside, and they're elderly and they're fragile, and you're going to cause a lot of deaths. And we think that it's the lockdowns and the accumulated stress and the very large fragile populations in the US. Also, obesity is known to strongly correlate with whether or not you're going to get these viral respiratory diseases and how badly you're going to get them. Okay, how badly you're going to be sick. So all in all, the US had these very high death levels in the summer, which is shocking. Um, and what we did is we looked at the magnitude of that death level in the summer. And what we find is when we put it on the map of the United States, it's occurring in the South, not there's a band in the South where you have high deaths in the summer, not elsewhere in the United States. So again, um, it's not something that is pandemic like, and that it's not for the whole country. It's not everywhere. It's just limited to the South where all the poverty is,
Mhm.
where all the most fragile people are, and so on. So that's what we're finding now. And so that's another reason we say that you can get a large number of deaths due to the measures and due to the assault against people
Mhm.
and their economic stability and what they do normally to get by and all of that. If you assault them in this way, one of the important areas of science that I have reviewed and that I've been talking about is the work of a Professor Cohen, who spent his whole career looking at the effect of stress on individual health. And what he showed in relation to viral respiratory diseases in particular is that, and he was doing this back in the 70s when you were allowed to infect university students in your studies with influenza, directly infect them, okay, purposefully. And what he found is that the students that had more stress in their lives were actually developing the clinical illness, whereas the ones that had less stress were not developing the clinical illness. And
Mhm.
he found two important control features of whether or not you're going to get the disease and how bad it's going to be when you get it. And this is for young students. Forget about old people. We're not even talking about old people now.
Yeah.
But what he found is that the two important parameters were the individual stress that you're subjected to or that you're experiencing in your life. And get this, the other equally important thing is the degree to which you have social contacts, the degree to which you're isolated socially.
Wow.
So that tells you, these are not subtle features. He didn't have to do a randomized control trial to find this out. It was obvious.
Yeah.
It came right out of his data. And he's been writing about this for decades. So that tells you right there that the worst thing you can do for elderly people who, and it's known scientifically that elderly people, everything that is bad about stress is an order of magnitude worse for elderly people. I mean, the stress response, the stress connection to illness is much stronger in elderly people than in young people. All
Mhm.
right. So the worst thing you can do, therefore, to elderly people
It's
in a situation like this is to isolate them,
yeah.
and stress them out with the fear of a pandemic and fearful attendants who are wearing masks and gloves and who don't want to go into the room and all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
So create stress and isolate them socially. And that is the worst you can do in terms of whether they will catch this disease and suffer from it. So there you go. That's what's, if they had wanted to follow the science, it's almost like they did the opposite of what the science would have told them to do.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why I say it's the measures that killed people.
Well, yeah, and another of your tweets was specific to young Canadian males. I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to get into that, but also in that tweet you mentioned, you mentioned the deafening media silence. I'm sorry. Before that, I just want to say this is old news, but anyway, and I'm sure you're well aware of it. But sometime last year, UK Column revealed that the Scientific Advisory Group, SAGE, there was an internal document where they explicitly said to use the media to create more fear amongst the public.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, I had heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's not exclusive to the UK government, of course. I mean, given how rampantly hysteric the media has been worldwide.
Yeah. No, it's immoral the way that this was handled. It's wrong. It's criminal. It's criminal. There should be criminal investigations in relation to these deaths. Actual investigations of cause of death on a case-by-case basis related to care homes and so on. There should be many criminal investigations. There aren't. So there were some criminal investigations in Quebec in relation to attendants not going into work out of fear and abandoning people in the care homes who died of being abandoned.
Yeah.
So there are a few criminal investigations in that regard, but there should be many more, especially in New York and so on. There aren't. Yeah. Okay, where were we? Yes,
we were Canada, with young Canadian males. Yeah.
Well, Canada. See, the U.S. is the only country where deaths in the summer that are anomalously high, large number of deaths, visibly occurred in the all-cause mortality data. That you can really see it, and it's stunning. It's unmistakable in magnitude. But Canada, if you look at the data carefully, you can see that there were summer deaths in Canada as well, but you see them really come out in the young age group among males. So young males in Canada, statistically speaking, died significantly above what normally would happen in the summer, in that summer between 2020 and 2021. So that is very significant, and it targets a specific group. So that is something that should be talked about. It should be all over the media, and our experts who are supposed to protect public health and so on, they should be signaling this in every possible way and trying to figure out what happened and so on. Now, young males don't die from viral respiratory diseases, okay, generally speaking, and in particular COVID is said not to attack young people, virtually not. The only people who die from it really are very elderly, virtually the only people who die from it. So what happened in the summer when these diseases do not transmit and that targeted young men up to, I think it was 0 to 45 in age, I would postulate that it's all about the stress and the impact of the economic collapse
Yeah.
So you basically, a lot of young men would have their agency in the world through work, part-time work, a lot of summer employment. Uh, all of that is disrupted. They're more isolated. They have less meaning in their lives.
Hmm.
They are told that they're redundant, basically. And I think that the stress and the isolation from all of that could cause all kinds of problems, including risky behavior, wanting to self-harm, abuse of alcohol and drugs. There could be so many factors that enter into explaining this, but there'll be factors of that type.
Hmm.
It's not going to be related to a particular mutation of a particular viral respiratory disease.
Yeah.
No, it's not going to. They don't transmit in the summer. It's not about that. So that was my point about young men dying in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think earlier, I've escaped all of this, having left Canada in February last year. So I haven't experienced, any of what you and my family and friends have been going through. You're in Ontario, you're in Ottawa, correct?
Yes.
So you're in probably the most brutal lockdown province, or
At the,
not
at,
even.
at this time, yes.
Yeah, maybe not
Yeah.
not even just province. I mean, would it be correct to say Ontario has been the harshest area in North America in terms of lockdown and
I think
the
that's fair.
defense?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the only competition in that regard would come from Australia and
Yes.
in the southern hemisphere, where they're really crazy, even beyond Ontario level crazy. But yeah.
So now, just maybe stepping away from science, just to talk about your own personal observations, what you're seeing, like what you've seen over the past year, and what you're seeing now in terms of what restrictions are being put on people, how people are handling it, and have you seen any change in, perhaps like a year ago, people were really afraid of a pandemic, but now are more people asking questions and saying this is ridiculous, or what's been going on?
Well, okay. I have to tell you that the lockdowns and the response um, has been brutal
Yeah.
on disadvantaged people. Absolutely brutal. And I know this from personal research and so on, like actually talking to people and so on. So there are a number of people in our society who get by on social welfare, but who have all kinds of part-time jobs under the table that gives them social contact, gives them a bit of extra money, it gives them meaning in their lives. All of that was destroyed when all of a sudden everyone has to be controlled. No economic activity that's not essential. That's all eliminated. All the places where these people would get employment, like all the small bars and restaurants and places like that, where they'd be washing dishes or cleaning up after hours and all this kind of stuff, disappears from one day to the next. So the disadvantaged people who live in society in that way were brutalized by closing of all of these businesses and of the economy, and the way that they could not have normal contacts anymore.
Mhm.
Even just so it would have been brutal in that area of society. It would have also been brutal in with small businesses.
Yeah.
Now they were getting compensation. The government was buying out a lot of people, a lot of working people. They gave them compensation, but it doesn't compensate for the loss of meaning in your life, the loss of the sense of doing something in the world that is useful, that's appreciated, and in
Mhm.
contact with people. Being paid out does not compensate those things, and those are important factors in individual health. So I think we see that if you do it for long term, we see a really big public health impact in that regard. So it is the working classes, the independent businesses, and the underemployed classes that suffer the most. The professional classes have not suffered in this way. They have continued work from home, continued having meetings through Zoom. They are the Zoom class,
Yeah.
and they are the ones who follow the mainstream media and are happy to comply with whatever the government says because they want to show that they are good people, obeying the rules and trying to be, that whole meme that, I'm wearing the mask for you, not for myself. This whole idea of a one-way mask when you were talking about transmission through aerosol particles, which is just an absurdity. That meme has caught on and people actually think this, they actually believe it, it's just crazy. But the professional class has been able to spend more time at home with children, with family, has commuted less. There's less commuting because they're working from home. So it has been really good for the professional class. And I think they support whatever measures the government want to put in place in this way for this reason. And in fact, in the professional classes, they actually see their professional class neighbors more because they interact outside, they go walking, they see each other more, they have less actual contact, so they have a tendency to meet in that way, keeping distance and so on. But so it's been good for the professional classes, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because that maintains this, it keeps it going, right?
Yeah.
So there's a real disparity in who has suffered and who has not suffered.
And you're right. If there were more people, especially particularly media, highlighting the suffering that you're talking about, and there's of course suffering amongst children who, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I mean, you don't have to be to understand that children growing up seeing all these masked figures are going to grow up very, I don't want to say disturbed, but it's going to disrupt their normal growth of a child.
That's not, Eva, that's not just guessing. I actually wrote a large paper on the harms due to masks. That was the focus of my paper. And I reviewed the scientific literature that says exactly what you've been saying and much more. I looked at all the various branches of harms from masks. And there's no doubt in my mind from having read these papers and reviewed them that children living in a masked world, young children not seeing their parents' faces, even infants, that this has long-term negative effects on them. Has long-term. There's a study that showed that it harmed the ability to learn languages, to really profoundly learn languages and meaning and so on. It retarded your development in that sense, to not see lips moving and fully see the facial expression during speech. And so there are all kinds of papers. It's become more of interest to many scientists now, the negative impacts of masks. And I reviewed that recently and wrote a paper about it. Yes.
And I would say also that like children having a lot more screen time than probably most parents would normally have given their kids. I know, having talked with my brother, he has 2 young kids, and they can have a certain amount of screen time, but not all day. They also read and they play with their friends at the playground. But now if all of this has become impossible and you can't go to school any longer and you're forced to be on the screen, I can't even imagine what kind of impact that's going to have on them.
Well, just one anecdote. There was a primary school teacher who explained to me that the Zoom class that she was doing, the most important part of the Zoom class was that, sorry, I just got a distraction there. Someone's at the door downstairs. So the most important part was the 10 minutes where the Zoom was on and the kids could interact with each other. They came to the Zoom class to have that 10 minutes and 5 minutes at the end or something where they could actually, do the usual things that children do through Zoom. It's really sad.
Yeah.
And then for the rest of the time, you have to pretty much force them to sit there and be subjected to this class. So that's what it's become. There's much more. It's a lot easier for kids to interact in an actual physical school, because you've got the hallway, you've got the washroom, you've got the yard outside, you've got where they're actually seeing each other and interacting. You've got, you can see each other in the classroom more easily, and you can more easily not be seeing each other as well than in a Zoom where the teacher sees everybody, on a screen right away. You can see everyone. That you can surveil people in a group much more easily on a Zoom call than in an actual room. I noticed this myself because I'm involved in legal battles, big legal battles, and I've been to administrative tribunals or even court through Zoom, and it gives you a real advantage. You can observe the judge's reactions and the other lawyers and everything. You see it all in one place. You don't have to look at your notes, look up, not miss something or anything. You actually see everything that's happening. So the ability to surveil in a group setting is much greater with Zoom. So that has both, in certain contexts that can be positive, in other contexts like education, where children need the outlets, they need all that subtext of their defiance against this very oppressive educational system. They need that subtext. It can be not so good, you know.
I want to go back to science related issues in that my understanding is that a lot of the decisions that are made, say, let's just take Ontario, for example, the decisions that are implemented are based on the expertise of the chief medical officers. Is that correct? So you, again, with your very vast background, not to compare you to them, but let's do that. Would you say these people are competent authorities, competent in positions that they are competent to be making such decisions?
Well, you know, I'm going to answer in an odd way that you maybe don't expect, okay?
Okay.
I had the occasion recently to look into their actual formal training. So I'm doing research now, and also with another academic, where we're looking at, for example, the Chief Medical Officer of Canada. Does she have the medical specialization to be a public health officer?
Mm-hmm.
Because what I found out in looking at the institutional structures and everything, you know, medicine has specialties and you have to be certified to practice in a given specialty. Well, guess what? There is a very specific and very serious certification for public health medicine. Mm-hmm. And it is a rigorous training. And the certification is controlled by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. And so you're either certified or you're not in that area of medicine. And if you're not certified in that area of medicine, you're not supposed to practice it. Mm-hmm. You cannot practice a specialization of medicine that you're not certified in.
Seems logical.
So yeah, and that certification process, the training for that is 5 years and more of very specific training to be a public health medical specialist. Now, it turns out that most medical officers in the various counties in Ontario, for example, most but not all, have that certification. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Theresa Tam, the Chief Medical Officer of Canada, is not certified in public health and community health.
Wow.
She is not certified in that area of medicine. And and not only that, but if you look at where she is certified in a college of medicine, she's certified in Ontario, she works in Ottawa, and her certification specifies that she is only allowed to practice medicine in the areas in which she was trained, not other areas. So a lot of these certificates have conditions attached to them. Well, Theresa Tam has that condition attached to hers.
And so what areas are her expertise?
So her expertise is epidemiology, which is very different. It's a separate expertise. It's a separate specialization, and family medicine, I think. I'm just from memory, but right. She has two specializations, which are not the public health specialization that you need to be a public health officer. Okay. The same is true of the provincial chief public health officer of Saskatchewan, who is her only specialty is anesthetic, you know, putting people to sleep for operations, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's her only specialty. She's not, and yet she was involved in firing a surgeon who was critical of vaccinating children. They summarily fired. She was involved. She was in part of the committee of 3 that fired him.
Wow.
And justified that firing. And she is not certified in that area. And there are many top people who are not even certified medically mm-hmm. to practice the kind of medicine they are practicing in that position.
Now, is this something the Ontario Civil Liberties Association or Rocco Galati or any of the prominent bodies and voices that have been speaking out are going to be addressing?
Well, I think I'm the first to point this out. I've been pointing it out on Twitter, and I've been linking to the certification pages and explaining what this specialization is and how it's absolutely designed for exactly these people and how therefore you must be certified, right?
Wow.
And there are scientific research articles that explain the prevalence of this certification and its importance in the world of public health and comparing Canada to other countries and so on. It's all known that this is how you need to be trained if you're going to occupy those positions. Well, there's something like, I don't know, 20% of public health officers in Ontario that are not certified in that way. So there you go. That's just on the establishment certification. But you asked me the broader question, are these people actually competent?
Mm-hmm.
And what I am shocked by is that the majority of these people who are certified in public health medicine are not competent to read the scientific literature and are writing reports that distort the scientific literature. They'll emphasize things from unreliable research that is not randomized controlled trials, that is full of bias. Because they like the results, they'll emphasize those and use that as pretexts for their policies, the policies that they're recommending, and they will not emphasize the high quality research that is free of bias, which says the opposite of the research that they are selecting to emphasize. So I have to conclude that either they didn't keep up with training, they're not able to read scientific literature, either they're incompetent or they're biased professionally and they're acting politically.
Yeah.
It's one or the other in my eyes.
I think the latter is probably a safe guess or safe assumption.
Yeah, it's probably a mix of the two. I'm sure there are many of them who can't read a scientific paper and don't really understand what, do not take up the time and wouldn't really be able to appreciate these scientific papers. I think it's a combination of the two.
Well, on this
and not really being able to appreciate the science makes it easier to act politically as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this comes kind of full circle to how we started the conversation, because I cited your tweet where you were talking about glaring omissions and false working assumptions. So it's kind of I don't know, kind of poetic that we've come back to where we started from. And with that, I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate all of your time and knowledge that you shared. It's actually, I know you have a lot more you can say, and it would be really good to talk another time, do another round of hearing what you have to say and what you've looked into. But I think we'll wrap it up for today so that people can digest. I know I have to re-listen to our interview to fully digest what you've said.
It was a great pleasure, Eva. I really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate your work and your efforts, your journalism, your interviews, your communicating. I'm one of your fans. I think you know that. I think you know that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Denny. And you've been doing remarkable work. I mean, I know, okay, maybe it was for your masks that you were on Highwire, right? With Del Bigtree?
Yes.
And I'm sure you've done a number of other interviews. Maybe do you actually want to just drop some names of other interviews you've done?
Oh, I have a poor memory for that, but I've done so many, and I have to say I'm refusing the majority of requests for interviews because
I'm so honored that you spoke with me.
Yeah, you're an exception. I have been refusing all kinds of interviews, but because of my appreciation of your work, I wanted to do this one, and I've been refusing the interviews for two reasons. One is I need the time to continue my scientific research related to COVID. That's one. And secondly, I've been involved in a big legal battle trying to get a medical person disciplined through a disciplinary council. And so I've been involved in that in a very serious way, and it's been ongoing for a couple of years. And there are moments when there are hearings, I have to dedicate myself to that. Okay. So my time is really partitioned, and I've been refusing a lot of interviews. how did I get onto that?
Because I asked you, so I'll shift my question. Then I asked you to maybe talk about some of the interviews you've done. How about
Oh,
just
yeah.
this? Where's the best place? I will be sharing your Twitter, but where's the best place for people to find your collection of writings
Okay.
and interviews?
I'm in the process of building a new website, and someone's
Excellent.
helping me with that. It's coming up soon, but right now you can go to my blog, Activist Teacher,
Mhm.
blogspot.com. And I think the second article down is a list of all the links of all my COVID work. And at
Fantastic.
the bottom of that is two playlists of video interviews. One's on
Excellent.
YouTube and the other's on BitChute, I think. So I
Okay.
try to, when I see my videos of my interview, I try to put them in those lists. So you can get a lot of them that way.
Fantastic. I will find those links and put them in the YouTube and Odyssey upload of this. Thank you
Yeah.
again.
But I have not been fair to the people who've interviewed me, not because it would take me time to remember the names and everything.
No,
But
no, that's
there've been a lot, and they're well known, and I really appreciated my interactions with them, and they've been all over the world as well, and in France a lot as well, in Quebec, in South Africa, in the United States, everywhere. I've been on some great shows that I really appreciated. I'm just remembering them now.
yeah.
And I'm sorry that I can't, honor them by naming them all. But yeah,
No, you know what? I'm sorry. It wasn't fair of me to drop that on you because you're obviously a man who's working very hard on many things, and it's nice of you to give me your time considering all of that. So I'm sure anybody who's listening that might have interviewed you will totally understand.
great.
Okay. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
My pleasure. Bye, Eva.